Bien. Et au cas... Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for this. Can you hear me? No?
Maybe sitting down would be more comfortable for you too.
Now, is it? Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Professor Feely for inviting me to take part in this extremely important and interesting conference. We have been friends for a long time. Professor Feely was a Fulbright professor at my university in the old days when the Soviet Union collapsed. He was the first Fulbright professor in Belarus. And he was extremely important for establishing links between my country and educational establishments in the United States. And I'm really very happy to be here and see him again. Belarus became an independent country only after the collapse of the Soviet Union, though the Sovereignty Act adopted by the Supreme Soviet of the Byelorussian Socialist Republic on July the 27th, 1990. The United States recognized the independence of Belarus and established diplomatic relations with the newly born country on December the 25th, 1991, following the disintegration of the Soviet Union, of which Belarus was an integral part and one of its founders. However, the links between the two countries go back to the birth of the USA. One of the remarkable people who played a great role in the American War of Independence was Tadeusz Kościuszko, born of a Belarusian mother. Over the centuries-long history of the USA, descendants from Belarus played a role in the development of America. Simon Kuznets, born in the small town of Pinsk, got a Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for his empirically founded interpretation of economic growth, which has led to new and deepened insight into the economic and social structure and process of development. The hall of the United Nations Organization headquarters in New York is decorated with a stained glass window entitled Peace, made by the Belarusian Jewish artist Marc Chagall, who also authored the Good Samaritan stained glass window at Union Church in the heart of Washington Irving's Sleepy Hollow country in town Tarry, infusing the artistic genius of a man from Eastern Europe into the culture of New England. Among the descendants of emigres from Belarus who found their new home in the USA are famous writers and people of art. The first years of the US-Belarusian relations developed against the background of severe economic and political difficulties that were aggravated by the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster. Belarus suffered most among the neighboring countries affected by the nuclear catastrophe. And after the establishment of diplomatic relations, the USA tried to render the necessary assistance to help the Belarusian people battle with adversity at various levels, including interstate financial assistance and the effort of numerous American charity and volunteer organizations that provided medical advice and took care of Belarusian children from the affected territories who were given a possibility to take rest and medical treatment in the United States. Taking into account the high educational level of the Belarusian population, the diligence and efficiency of Belarusian workers, American companies began to invest in Belarusian economy, hoping to gain profit from cooperation with Belarus. There started first joint ventures, exchanges of professionals, visits of academics, and on a wide scale, all-round cooperation in various spheres. And the first sign of it was, as you may understand, McDonaldization of Belarus and Kokolization of its population. One of the most important aspects of cooperation in those days was education. The early 1990s were remarkable for the intensive search of new horizons for higher education in Belarus. Intensive work was being done to improve university curricula and syllabi and adapt them to international requirements. Serious changes were introduced into the academic process to make the students not only objects, but also subjects of the educational process. Great efforts were made to integrate science and education at a deeper level. new channels of international cooperation were opened, allowing Belarusian universities get into direct contacts with their foreign partners. Academic exchanges became an integral part of university life, enriching the academic environment. One of the examples was the first round of exchanges of faculty and students of my university and Southwestern Oklahoma State University that took place in August 1991. And here I might say that the first group of American students arrived in Minsk on August the 18th, 1991, one day before the coup. The person who was instrumental in implementing this project was Professor Francis Feely, who spared neither time nor effort to make the project work. Though everyday life in Belarus in those days was extremely difficult, it proved to be not the biggest challenge. Integration of courses offered by the two universities, respectively, into their curricula proved to be a major concern of the administrators of the project, revealing both intersections and serious differences in approaches to organizing the academic process in the two countries. The credit system was absolutely new for the Belarusians, and enrollment of students in courses which they chose themselves was a test of the efficiency of Belarusian academics. In addition, the students who came to Minsk had different fields of specialization and different goals, and it was necessary to adapt a number of courses to their needs, which in those days was something new and experimental. On the other hand, the Belarusian students had the same kind of background and similar goals, which made their adaptation to the American system less painful. Of some advantage was the fact that the role of the Ministry of Education in those days was more of advisory nature, and it did not involve long battles with bureaucrats concerning the changes in the curricula which we have now. The lessons of the first exchanges were learned when Belarus became a partner of the NIS College and University Partnership Program, promoting academic institutional linkages for the newly independent states. The new project that involved Belarus funded the exchange of students and faculty and helped to introduce distance learning as a new educational strategy, as well as collaborative learning as a new form of partner cooperation. It focused on non-hierarchical and collaborative learning at a distance, using innovative emerging internet technologies and learning new teaching and coaching methodologies. The project stimulated greater interaction between the universities of the two countries, exchange of faculty and students, development of online educational projects, joint publications, accreditation of collaborative courses, recognition of credits, development of more adequate evaluation systems, and monitoring the academic process, and was beneficial to both parties. This was the time when Belarusian professionals got involved in various programs of training in the USA within the Fulbright, Muskie, IREX, and other programs, which exposed them to new technologies, latest developments in different branches of science, and this was especially important, new information technologies which were only coming to Belarus. I remember the first time I came to the USA and saw electronic catalogs. I could not imagine that this would ever take place in my own university. Multiple programs of people-to-people, academic and professional exchanges helped to bridge gaps between the nations and promote friendship and understanding. The scope of contacts was so big that in 1993, the then head of Belarus, Stanislav Shushkevich, paid an official visit to the USA that was reciprocated by President Bill Clinton, who came to Minsk on January the 15th, 1994. At the beginning, a lot of things offered by our American partners were taken for granted. Everything was so new and exciting that the very idea of being part of the whole project overshadowed certain criticisms that began to appear when we started introducing those things into our curricula, into our everyday practice, because that did not involve our traditions and our values, which in many ways were different. A more sober approach began to form as cooperation developed, making our American partners also introduce changes into their approaches. The United States really helped Belarus to work out a program of microeconomic stabilization and related reform measures, creating a favorable climate for business and investment. However, it was done in such a way that, as a result, the shining shop windows of famous transnational companies defeated the realistic approach to things when beggars fought for empty bottles to get a refund, while big shots bought football teams, and organized various kinds of spectacles that annoyed the people. And this led to extremely dramatic changes in the history of the country. By 1994, some level of stability seemed to have been reached, though there were big groups of population that felt threatened and insecure in the new economic system that called for individual effort and individual responsibility for one's own life and work. And it was especially painful to those categories of people who could not provide for themselves, especially pensioners who had practically lost everything after the collapse of the USSR and found it extremely difficult to fit into the new mode of life that offered glamour and an illusion of success, but took away social security guarantees. One of the major factors that divided the nation in the 1990s was the nationalist feeling that became pronounced but was perceived differently by various social and ethnic groups. One has to remember the long history of the suppression of Belarus. It used to be part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, later of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 14th, 18th centuries, then part of the Russian Empire, 18th, 20th centuries, and finally the USSR, 1991, 1991. And nationalist feelings after the emergence of a new independent country began to influence the developments in Belarus. These feelings were inspired by a number of various factors, and they include, as one of the most important one, the painful psychological effects of Chernobyl, the trauma caused by the fact that in order to save Russia's biggest cities, Moscow, Nizhny Novgorod and Voronezh, the Soviet leadership sacrificed the safety of Belarus by shifting the direction of the nuclear clouds from east to west. As a result, 70% of the nuclear fallout affected the territory of Belarus, which, it was understood by the Belarusians, was regarded as the buffer zone for Russia. 25% of the population found themselves on the affected territories. After the declaration of national independence, when disgusting facts concerning the truth about the Chernobyl disaster and the policy of the Soviet government became known, large groups of the locals took an openly anti-communist stand, which, for the Belarusian situation, was also demonstratively anti-Russian, because the Soviets were associated with Moscow and Moscow was associated with Russia. And this divided the nation. This was because the next issue is the national awakening. When the nation began to acquire its own identity free from the diktat of Moscow. The independence of Belarus, in fact, was not something which people had been really fighting for. It came out of the blue. The Supreme Soviet of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, adopting the Sovereignty Act in 1990, wanted to save the position of the elite. And this creates another extremely important problem for Belarus. It was, on the part of the nation, it was an emotional response to the centuries-old attempts by different foreign powers to impose their language and values on the Belarusians, who were not regarded as a nation. In the Russian Empire, the word Belarus was not used. This territory, which is now Belarus, was called the Northwestern Territory, or the Northwestern Area. And that's why in an attempt to introduce changes in relation to Belarus, historians began great work on introducing a new vision of Belarusian history, which was very much informed by nationalistic feelings. In fact, one of the most important events in the history of Belarus was the fact that in the 16th century, the Belarusians, who were part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, defeated the Russian army at Orsha. In fact, it became one of the most glorious moments, and the radicals insisted that this day should be considered to be a national holiday for Belarusians, showing their disintegration from Russia. The new books on history that appeared emphasized the role of Belarus in the growth of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, when Old Belarusian was the country's written language. The ancient Belarusian emblem, pagonia, that was inscribed on the banners of Belarusian soldiers who took part in the Battle of Grunwald against the Teutonic Order in 1410, became the coat of arms of the new state, and their white, red, white flag, the national flag. This was to show that in spite of the lack of the history of sovereign Belarus, it had long historical traditions. Another important factor that divided the nation was the question of language. For several centuries, the Belarusian language was not considered to be a language. It was considered to be a northwestern dialect of the Russian language. And language, therefore, became a battlefield in the early 1990s. But for the short period of Belarusian awakening in the 1920s, which ended in Stalin's purges with prominent people sent to death for bourgeois nationalism, Belarusian was used only in a limited sphere and began to disappear from general use. That's why serious efforts were necessary to restore its status of the language of the nation. As a result, it was made the only state language of Belarus. Educational institutions had to swiftly shift to Belarusian. But the mistake which was made by the radicals was that instead of step-by-step tactics, they tried to act fast, and this led to serious changes. The decision alienated large groups of the Belarusian population who were not prepared for such radical steps. Traditionally, a lot of Belarusian students went to study in Moscow, St. Petersburg, other great cities, and with the exclusion of Russian from the curriculum, it meant that they could no longer hope to go and study in those famous universities. And the parents felt alienated by this. During the national referendum of '96, the majority voted for bilingualism and showed signs of annoyance at the anti-Russian rhetoric of the leaders of the Belarusian Popular Front, which was established in 1988 as both a political party and a cultural movement, following the examples of similar popular fronts in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. At that period, it was supported approximately by 30% of the population of Belarus. On paper, its goals seemed to be noble. The revival of the national idea, rebirth of the Belarusian language, and independence through national rebuilding. However, a lot of mistakes were made during the period of transition. Instead of rallying people around the idea of national revival, they took a divisive stand. From the beginning, it oriented towards the West, rejecting the need for continuing links with Russia, looking at ethnic Russians in Belarus as the fifth column in the country. Some of the leaders even called for creating the union from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea that would involve Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, and Lithuania, and supporting Belarus's entry into NATO and European Union. On the other hand, a bigger part of the population did not share such radical suggestions and continued to believe in continuing cooperation with Russia. This led to serious changes in the political situation in the country. The divide between the two major groups of the population was used by political forces that finally came to power on the tide of public dissatisfaction with the government's political and economic performance, dictated by the International Monetary Fund. The people en masse did not support the policy. The West, which had been conducive to the policy of the Popular Front, underestimated the strength of tradition and the power of Belarusian national mentality. Its open support of the nationalist opposition provoked a number of serious conflicts and did not allow cooperation between Belarus and the West develop smoothly. And the USA was especially involved in it. Which created situations that the United States, in fact, and other countries temporarily recalled their ambassadors from Belarus in 1998. In early September 2001, the United States condemned Belarus for having irregularities in the recent election. The Belarusian authorities acted as harshly, dividing Belarusians into proper and improper ones, again a divisive line. The Orange Revolution in Ukraine developed fears that Belarus was looked at as the buffer zone again, this time between the West and Russia, and it provoked a new wave of tension, reaching its climax after the events in Minsk quite recently. And cooperation between the USA and Belarus is now reduced only to some very small projects. The jigsaw puzzle in the relations between Belarus and the USA is far from being solved. The opposition in Belarus is weak and divided. At the moment, nationalist ideology no longer plays the role it used to play in the early 1990s. Other factors are at play. As Lionel Biener wrote in The Guardian 2 years ago, Belarus is, quote, the buffer zone between NATO and Russia, a vital transit route for Europe-bound energy supplies, and a state with an appalling human rights record. It cannot be ignored, cannot be denied. Analyst Natalia Leshchenko does not rule out the possibility of the Belarus president concentrating and pulling out a credible and unifying national ideology himself. The possibility is small, but should not be ruled out entirely. His ability to play this scenario will depend on his perception of the vulnerability of his position and having an intellectual range of available solutions at hand. In this case, Belarus would become a neutral state, trading equally with Europe and Russia, with a more relaxed and relatively legitimate regime, though not a liberal democracy. However, it is difficult to predict at the moment which way Belarus will go in the near future. Thank you.